This is part 2 of the conversation with Travis Fritz and John Haggerty.
So now, this is where, and it is not a momentous occasion for you, but for me, it absolutely was.
No, it's a big deal. So I'm working at Min Brew, brewmaster there. Well, the guy that hired me, his name is Sig Plagans, and Sig's still around. Sig was a German dude, and still, had this accent like he was like right off the boat, man. I mean, you wouldn't have known that he had been working in the brewery there in St. Paul for who knows how 20 years or something, 30 years. Right. And that was a really interesting crew of guys, right? Because those guys, that was a union brewery. It was big. The brew house was like 800 barrels. I mean, it was massive, right? Jesus. And those guys were all union guys. And so I was in the union there, which was great.
Was it the machinist union? I think I remember.
It was Aerospace Engineers Union, right?
Yeah, it was the same union.
There had been a brewers union up in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area because there had been, lots of breweries, Hams and Blatz and Stroh's and, Min Brew, which had been a Schmidt brewery originally. Grain Belt had their own brewery. And there's all, so there had been a pool of labor that had been there that had unionized. But that was all gone, right? I mean, at the time, you had the craft brewers that were there, and you had Min Brew, and that was it. Stroh's closed their last plant up there in like 97 or 98 because I was still working at the club when I was there, and I had a handful of guys from Stroh's try to come in and apply for jobs, and I was like, it's a one-man show, man. Anyway, so I was there, and it was great. Phil Gagne, Zig retired. I was like the last guy that Zig hired. Really interesting guy. And then Phil Gagne became the brewmaster, and then George Brown and Tom Clark were the assistant brewmasters. And I talked to Phil still periodically. I talked to Tom a lot. Tom and I got to be really good friends, and I just talked to Tom a couple of days ago. Also a great mentor for me because Tom's father was an artist. He liked to weld. And so he basically grew up in a junkyard, right? Because his dad would collect anything that was metal and throw it in the backyard and then go weld these sculptures and stuff together. And so Tom learned how to fix all these machines. And over time, my relationship with Tom taught me how to do a lot of maintenance work on machines and how to think about machines. And it was a really invaluable experience for me because now I'm able to do stuff. Because, we were talking about growing up, my grandfather had been a roofer, right? And so they weren't super wealthy. My dad wasn't super wealthy. And so they had to fix all their stuff themselves. But then my dad, my dad worked for a bank and my dad hated doing that stuff. And he made enough money. He didn't have to change his own oil, right? So consequently, he didn't teach me how to do any of it. Right. What he was trying to teach me was make enough money so you don't have to do it, right?
Pretty common from that generation to the next.
Yeah. And so I didn't know how to do that stuff. And so when I met Tom really was the one that taught me how to do all that kind of thing. And so another really great mentor for me, and by the way, Tom owns a little brewery over in Berwick, Pennsylvania now, which is in the middle of nowhere. And it makes great beer and great pizza. I think he's trying to sell it. So if anybody's looking to buy a little brewery in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, there's one for sale in Berwick.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Really, really great dude. But I digress. So I worked for those guys. I worked in the union. Union was interesting because those guys, they had different nomenclature for stuff. And all these guys had been there since they got home from the Vietnam War, right? So they'd been there for the better part of 30 years when I showed up.
Jesus.
Right. And some of those guys, some of them would tell you some stories about, this guy, Tom Blaha, I think his last name was. Tom got trapped behind the Viet Cong lines for 2 weeks by himself.
Jesus.
Just running around in the jungle trying to make it back. And he did. And I never saw the guy sit down, ever. You'd be in the lunchroom and the guy just paced. Just, some of these guys were, you know, and they graduated from high school, went to the war, came back, got a job in the plant in the neighborhood that the plant was in, because it was all residential around them. They all lived there, you know, walked to work. And, you know, you'd hear these stories about like back in the day, because, you know, previous to about 76 or 77, breweries didn't think that they had any liability for giving their staff alcohol while they were at work, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. 100%.
I can't remember what year that was exactly, but it was Coors, right? They got sued because one of their employees killed someone driving home, just out of their mind, wasted. Because these old plants, they used to have taps in like every room.
Yes.
And
Yes.
all day, right? And these guys would just drink through their whole shift. In fact, and these guys are telling me stories like, yeah, people used to come to work 2 or 3 hours early.
Yes.
So they could sit here and drink before they started working. And then they would get off work and they'd go hang out in the break room. And their wives would have to walk over from the neighborhood in order to pull them out of the break room to get them to come home for dinner and see their kids.
Jeez.
Right. And then like the cops, you know, the cops knew there were free beer. So the cops would come by when they would get off shift and sit in the break room with the brewers and have beers for free. Right. And so the cops and the brewers were all buddies. And so if you were on your way home, or if you were in an inebriated state and you got yourself in some trouble, the cops would show up, they'd see you, and they just pull you out, put you in the squad car, drive you home, drop you off, no problem. Right. Yep. I mean, that's the way the world used to work.
It is the way the world used to work.
I mean, then that's all gone. So being able to sit there with these guys and hear these stories, right, about how it used to be, like there was a guy, you know, he was gone before I got there, but I was running what we call the industrial filter, right, which is a DE filter.
Of course.
They called it the industrial filter. And so there was this spot that you would always stand in while you were running it, because the sight glass was right there, so you could see the quality of the filtration as it passed by, right? And by the way, it's running 300 barrels an hour.
Jesus.
Right, which, you know, when I came over from the brew pub, I think the last year I worked at the brew pub, we did 350 barrels of beer for the whole year, right? And now I'm running this filter. We're doing 300 barrels in an hour, right?
Jeez Louise.
And, well, I'll tell you about the filter in a second, but where you stood to do that, there happened to be a little spot floor drain right there.
Oh, well, we know what that's.
And so I'm talking to the guys, and they're like, yeah, so-and-so ran this machine for like 25 years. And he would stand here and pull samples off the Zwickel and drink them.
Sure.
Right? The Zwickel's the sample cock. Then he'd just sit there and drink all day. And he would never go to the bathroom because he just peed down his leg of his pants into the floor drain.
That is not exactly what I was expecting that story to resolve into.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, it's like, what the deuce, right? I mean, and it was just endless stories like that. Like, we had up in A cellar. So there was A through F cellar was fermentation. So it was like 6 stories tall, right? And A cellar was all these rectilinear open top fermenters. And there's an aisle down the middle, and then there was square rectangle tanks on each side all the way down with swimmers in them and whatever. And so when you fill one tank, they were all 400 barrels. So you'd have to fill across the aisle, you know, tank, you know, A on the one side and B on the other side, whatever, because to get the yeast out from the back of the tank after the tank was empty, you had to have this long handled sort of squeegee thing to pull the yeast up to the drain point, because the bottom was flat, right?
Yep.
Well, the handle was so long, you had to stick it in the manway of the tank across the way. Or you
got it.
Get all the way to the back of the tank.
This is what you were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, right? Just organizing your space.
Right. So, anyways, one day I'm working there, and they had hired a new guy. I can't remember the guy's name. We'll call him Bob.
Okay, Bob.
So they're like, hey, take Bob up to A cellar and teach him how to clean the open top tanks. I'm like, yeah, okay, come on. So we go up there, and I hook all the hoses up and whatever, and open the drain on the tank and sort of walk him through. This is what you got to do. It's like, you know, if you have any problems, just give me a yell. I'm going to go across the work aisle, and I'm going to start working on the other tank. All right. So if anything seems out of whack, just give me a yell. I'll come over. So, you know, a few minutes go by, and he's like, hey, is there supposed to be water building up in this tank? And I'm like,
you're in it, buddy.
Yeah. I'm like, no. I said, just stop and let me come over. I come and I look over the side of the tank, and sure enough, there's about half a foot of water in the bottom of this tank. Huh. I'm like, what the heck is going on? So well, let me make sure I hooked up the hoses right. And so I climb down and I look at the drain. It's like, yep, the hose is coming off the tank drain. It's over to the spot drain on the floor, which was a pipe. We would attach it to a pipe. We didn't just let it run onto the floor. So I couldn't tell if any liquid was coming out or not. My supposition is there's not.
Right.
Building up in the tank. So I close the valve and I disconnect the hose from the tank and, open the valve back up to see if any water, nothing comes out. Like, all right. So I lean over and I look in the valve and I can see there's something in there. It looks like a sort of a black plastic garbage bag, like a Glad garbage bag, right? It's sort of that color of black green. I'm like, what the heck is that? So I stick my hand in there and pull this out, and then this valve is like 4 or 5 inches in diameter. So this giant stream of water comes. So I shut the valve and I turn and I look, and I'm holding the wing of a dead bat.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So the bat had come in because it's open top fermenter, right? This whole cellar. So they have to ventilate the cellar or it'd kill you when you walked in there, right?
Of course.
And so somehow it'd come in through the ventilation system, got overcome by the CO2 and nosedived into the tank. Right?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I take the bat and I get on the elevator and I go downstairs to the office and I'm like, hey, yo, Phil. There was a bat in a cellar up in this tank. I said, maybe you want to run some extra tests on that.
That batch.
He goes, we got a pasteurizer. Okay.
We ain't killing anybody, bottle it.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the kind of crap that went on there. I mean, it was constant. Like they called the whirlpool the swirl tank.
The swirl tank.
Swirl tank. And there was there's a union shop, so you were assigned to a job, right? So like I ran the industrial filter for a while. I was second shift kettle for a while. Well, there was a job, and depending on how long you'd been there, you had seniority and you'd get preferential treatment for whatever job you wanted or preference. So there was a job called the cooler man.
Cooler man. That sounds cool.
Yeah. You know what the cooler man did?
No.
He ran the heat exchanger.
What?
Yeah. Yes, that was his job. He ran the heat exchanger.
To run it, not and I suppose additional responsibilities to clean it. That's not.
Well, yeah, but it was interesting because you go through the swirl tank, and then once the swirl tank was done, you would pump it up to the pan, and the pan was basically a big rectangular buffer tank.
Okay.
Right, and so the cooler guy would receive the wort coming up to the pan. And then once the pan got a certain amount full, then he'd start to run it through the heat exchanger, and he had to watch the temperature or whatever and make sure that he was then also hooked up to the right tank, going into the right tank in whatever cellar we were going to. And he also had the responsibility of pitching the yeast. But over the course of a brew day, the guy had 8 hours on the clock. The guy probably did an hour and a half worth of work.
Yeah, maybe.
And the rest of the time, he's in the break room drinking coffee. Right?
Drinking coffee.
It was just the most crazy thing, multiple times having my, people threatening to kick my ass because I was working too hard. And, all the
union stuff.
All the typical union stuff. But, I mean, it really great experience and fun and good stories and whatever. So anyway, so I'm there and, it's like, okay, I need to go to brewing school because what was starting to happen, this is around 2000, I'd go in for job interviews for places and I'd get all the way to the end because I had 7 or 8 years of experience at the time for multiple breweries. And, I'd make it to the end, right? I'd be down to the last 2 or 3 candidates, but somebody would have a brewing degree. They might not have any experience, but they'd have a brewing degree.
Yep.
And, the HR person or whoever is in charge of hiring, the plant manager would be put in this position. Do I hire the experience or do I hire the degree? Well, If I hire the experience and the guy doesn't work out, that reflects poorly on me. But if I hire the degree and the guy doesn't work out, I can say, well, he had a degree. How was I supposed to know? Right.
Yep.
And so I would get all the way there and then I would lose out. So I'm like, okay, writing's on the wall. I got to go formalize this. I need to get my brewing degree. And I did a lot of looking around, and you'll recall at the time, I think like to go to Siebel, which was in Chicago, was about 18 grand.
Yep.
The program out at
UC Davis.
UC Davis, but it wasn't the 4-year program at Davis. It was the other program they ran through the extension college. I can't remember, but that was about 18 grand.
Yep.
Brewers Guild was 18 grand in it. Well, hey, look, VLB, $6 grand.
$6 grand. And
I get to go live in Germany for a year. So it's going to cost me like the same amount of money.
Yep.
And, I get to go live in Germany. So it's like, oh, I'm all about this. Now, I think part of that was because, as you recall, I mean, the VLB had gone from being sort of publicly supported and teaching everything in German and free for local students to like, hey, we're gonna strike out on our own, and we're gonna start to try to attract more international student body. And I don't think they really understood the value of what they were offering.
No.
Now I've had guys that have worked for me here in Ohio go to that program, and now the program is more commensurate in terms of cost with
what it
their
should
peer
be
group here in the U.S. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We got to steal, man.
Absolutely. And I mean, it was look, I went into this to the VLB with zero experience, none. Yeah. Right. I was an aimless 21-year-old, and I had to make a decision, and I spoke German. Right.
Yep. Which, by the way, was a huge help to me.
Good. Well, I think one hand washed the other in a lot of different ways there on that. But, I had no idea. I could imagine, I guess, but I had no real idea what I was getting into. And I think that you did. And for me, that interpretation from what we were being taught at the VLB to more real world kind of practical application was invaluable. I didn't even know what a brew house looked like. Yeah. Or what the individual pieces did. And conceptually, I still have a sensitivity to this, right? When I'm trying to explain things, man, I would sit that first semester in class and I'm still trying to figure out what exactly a lauter tun or a match filter does, right? Yeah. So the scientific concepts that we were learning weren't beyond me. I mean, that's something I had studied before, but the practical concepts were completely out of my ken, totally.
Yeah. Well, there's a vernacular in the brewery, right? That gets used. And if you don't know what those words mean, then how on earth are you going to know what people are talking about?
Right. Right. And I mean, I could, right. The German is a practical language. So a lot of times, for example, a pencil is called a lead stick. Still, Bleistift is what a pencil is called. It's a completely literal language. Everybody knows that about German, except for when it comes to brewing terms. And there are all these super archaic, completely untranslatable terms, right? So it's frustrating. Yep. But as I say, a great education. By the time I got done with it, there was a lot I was ready to do. But I certainly wasn't ready to do the things that I ended up doing. And so relied on you a lot. And other, kind of second wave brewers here in Michigan to teach me, including Dan Rogers and a lot of guys.
Dan's great. Yeah.
Yep. So in Berlin, right? We land in Berlin.
Well, I want to back up for a second too, just to give people some sense of timing on how this works, right? Because we went over in October of 2001. And what happened in September? 2001.
Yeah, I went. So my flight was scheduled on September 13th.
Yeah,
of 2001 to go. Yeah, because I had Stephanie at the time coming with me. So we had to set up something before school started. And we went over there with no plan. Right? I was going to go to the whatever Amt they had to find an apartment and register ourselves and all that kind of stuff. But Stephanie didn't speak German either, right? So we needed that extra time. I really wanted that extra time. And as it turns out, there was a week when nobody was flying anywhere. And that was right after September 11th, as you say.
Yeah. So it was interesting. I didn't, like you said, we've got all this set up. You've got your plans in place and you think, oh, this is going to happen. Right. I had my plans in place and I think this is going to happen. And then 9/11 happens. And so it's like, oh, what's going to happen now? Right. And so I think we were all sort of confronted with this, like, do I still go or do I back out?
Yep.
And clearly you and I and Stephanie decided that we were still up for it and we went. But my recollection was that there was a handful, maybe maybe 3, maybe 5, I don't know, other Americans that were supposed to have been there in our course.
Yep.
They didn't show up. So consequently, you and I were the only, folks from the United States that were there.
Yep.
Which made it interesting. And I think, we may have become friends anyways, but due to that fact, I think we became a lot closer.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. 100%. I would say if I were you at that time, I probably would not have gotten as close to, 21, 22-year-old dude who had no fucking idea what he was doing.
Yeah, but you got to keep in mind that most of the guys in that course were 21 or 22 years old with no fucking idea what so, there was that group of Japanese guys. Those guys were on
Yoshi,
but they were Japanese, and so it was hard to relate to them.
It was.
They were great. Koji was awesome.
Yeah.
I've tried to find him a couple times and nothing. Who knows?
They had such particular tastes and schedules is what I remember. You know what I mean? Like it was, I listened to jazz with a cigar and a glass of bourbon.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing.
From this time to this time.
Exactly. Right. It's like, what? Yeah. Let's go out and get wasted, bro. We're in Berlin. Come on.
Where's the you belongs, brother?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and then you have the folks that were foreign but European. We had a student from the Faroe Islands, right?
Annika. Yeah. A bunch of guys from South America. In fact, I just talked to Bruno via WhatsApp a couple days ago. I was like, hey, dude, you still drinking Fernet Branca? And I get this picture back with him holding a bottle of Fernet Branca because he and I used to go to this bar called the Astro Bar. Drink Fernet Branca and Coke and play chess.
Yeah. Do you know when was the last time you had I used to drink it with him too at Klein Sachs.
Klein Sachs.
You and I hung out with all the time.
Yeah.
When was the last time you had Fernet and Coke?
Probably when I left Berlin.
It's not good.
No.
I've had it since then, and I remember loving it when we were there, man. And it's that's like Bruno's favorite drink, but Bruno's exceptional. So he's an eccentric dude. Yeah. The last time I saw him, I think was at CBC in San Diego in probably 2008. But I've talked to him since then.
Yeah, I think I saw him.
He's living his best life down there in Argentina.
Yeah, he is. He's got a little brewery down there in called Berlina in Argentina. Great dude.
Yeah.
So
this is what have you heard from? Well, anyway, this is a conversation for another time when we're not trying to tell people what brewing is like. Maybe. But we had like Hiroko Takahara, who had her own really interesting story, and I mean, golly, there's a lot of people.
Yeah, Hiroko was great. Yeah,
but
Vilko,
but I think
Holger
Lampe,
and those guys were awesome, really good.
Yeah, Vilko actually came out here and spent a couple weeks with us in I think 2012. My kids were
right on.
And he is a boat captain in Scotland. The last time I heard, that was about a year and a half ago.
Oh, really? He's not brewing anymore?
Nope. I mean, he may have something to do with Holberg. Was his brewery in Berlin. I don't know, but. Yeah, he's a boat captain.
Sweet, good for him.
Yeah, he's a cool dude. Anyway, eccentric people like brewers are misfits to one degree or another.
Yeah.
So I fit right in, I think.
I think we all do.
And the experience in Berlin was super interesting, but for me, remains in my memory just this kind of overwhelming sort of pastiche of moments more than anything I could put a particular narrative to.
Yeah. I think my experience is a little bit different because from the brewing school perspective, it was right in my wheelhouse. I mean, I'd already been doing it for the better part of a decade when I showed up there. But the cultural part was harder for me than I think it was for you, because I couldn't speak German really.
Right.
And I couldn't speak German, period. I didn't know 2 words when I landed, and I had to learn it all on the fly in order to get around, just buy groceries and get myself fed. And I mean, ended up having a shaved head for most, because I couldn't tell the barber how to cut my hair, right? So, that was interesting. And I remember there was this little Asian restaurant sort of around the corner from the apartment building I lived in. And, I'd always have to go and point at the menu to order, because I couldn't say numbers. I couldn't speak the words. And one day I remember I went in and I knew how to say numbers, right?
Yeah, I remember when you learned how to say numbers.
I ordered something and the guy looked at me like, holy shit, learning how to speak German. I'm like,
yay!
But I went there a lot because it was funny. Those guys obviously are not German. They were Asian people. Right. And so whatever their status was, why they were there, I don't know. But they were a lot more tolerant of me.
Yes.
In my inability to speak German and understand what was going on, because they were in the same boat, right?
Yep. Yeah, well, and it was
there a lot.
I remember having conversations with the German students and German folks that knew both of us a lot, and I think and you would come up, and I think what was frustrating was, and I don't know if this is a German thing or just a human thing or what, but I think what was frustrating for them was you looked like everybody else there, right? Mm-hmm. And for them, things had to kind of line up. So if there was maybe an Asian person that worked at an Asian restaurant and they didn't speak German well, that's understandable, right? They clearly are not German. I lived across the street from the Sierra Leone Club, and I used to hang around there a lot and have a Guinness Extra with those dudes from Sierra Leone who spoke English. But likewise, Germans didn't really, they made, anyway. They understood, but with you, it was like, this guy should be speaking German, right? What is wrong?
Yeah.
And it wasn't something
that's what was wrong.
Well, and it's German is its own.
Yeah. Well, by the end of our time there, I could speak enough. I remember this guy, like random guy on the street. I'm walking down the street, pulled his car over and asked me for directions on how to get to the highway. And I understood what he asked me, and I was able to give him an answer. Right?
There you go.
Right. And so, I was learning it. But then I left and I came home, and of course.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I still talk to folks in Germany a lot in German just to keep it sharp. I try and watch movies in German to keep it sharp. It's a skill that I have so few. I don't want to lose that one.
No, and it's a great skill. You should put effort into that. And, I think if I remember, like your grandmother was German or something, right?
My great-grandmother was, yeah. She spoke a kind of German called Plattdeutsch, which is a lot more like Dutch than German. Yeah.
But so that gave you that foundation, right?
Yep.
And, my great-grandparents were German as well, as it turns out, on my mother's side. And my grandmother spoke German, but then World War II happened.
Yep.
And at World War II, it was bad to be German. And so as a German speaker, she and my grandfather were just like, we're not speaking German and we're not teaching it to our kids. And so that part of their culture was lost around World War II.
Yeah.
And so it's gone. It's out of our family, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there was something I had, I had a knack for. And like I said, man, I was just ambitious enough to know that if something was easy for me, I should probably try at it, because I wouldn't get a lot of those chances.
Yeah.
So we go, and I don't mean to gloss over it, but school is school.
Well, I got to say one more thing.
Yeah.
Right? Because I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Wackerbauer, because I love that dude. That dude was the man.
Not
right?
just Wackerbauer then.
Yeah. Ackerbauer was.
He's amazing.
He was king, man. I love that guy.
Yoda.
He was the beer Yoda.
Mm-hmm.
And I also need to bring up a friend and colleague, Oliver Wesselow, who I still keep in regular contact with. He's got his own little brewery in Hamburg now. And, Oliver was a great friend to me. He was one of the few Germans. There was a few. There weren't a lot. Holger and Wilco definitely were accommodating.
Yes.
And Oliver, for sure, because a lot of the other German people weren't.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
And Oliver really went out of his way to make me feel welcome in Germany. And it was great.
Yeah. Well, and remembering too, this is Berlin, man. This is a big, big city.
Yeah. Yes.
So for example, my experience as a teenager,
you froze up.
I had a scholarship in major, and Munich and Bavaria are much more rural. They're not as fast paced. It's not as real. It is now, but at the time it wasn't a real sort of hard city vibe. And people were real, but again, I spoke German, but people were really accommodating then. And Berlin, to me, being able to speak the language fluently just felt like New York, right?
Yeah.
Nobody had time for anybody. Nobody was patient.
Well, yes, I agree. That was part of it. That's definitely part of it.
Yeah, but there is a kind of a fuck you German attitude as well.
Yeah.
For sure. But Wackerbauer.
That wasn't the reason I brought it up. I brought that up because I owe those guys a thank you.
Absolutely. As do I. I wasn't as close to Oliver, certainly, but Wilco and Holger, I was. It's a lot. I mean, there are a lot of stories and all that kind of stuff that are interesting, but I think it is good to focus on Wackerbauer because he bridges generations and was alive during the Second World War.
Right. I mean, he used to tell us, he ran our theory lectures, right? And we'd be in a Brewing theory lecture, and he'd just break out some story about this is what it was like during the Berlin airlift.
Floor malting in short pants or whatever. Right. Yeah.
I mean, it was just crazy, the stuff. I mean, if you were paying attention, the stuff that he would drop, and just like, oh my God, that guy saw that, that guy lived that.
It was incredible. It was incredible to know. And well respected, but also, a conflicted guy about his own legacy, which was interesting for me at that age he talked to me about it.
Yes.
To Kunze, all this kind of stuff that he had worked so hard to generate, the VLB and what it was, and, created this legacy for himself, but was overshadowed at times by his peers in a way that seemed to frustrate him. And it was interesting to see that for me too.
Yeah. Yes. That's all true. And he did a couple things that I think if he could have undone, he would have. And it's sort of tarnished his legacy at the VLB, unfortunately. I'm not going to really go into that stuff, but
yeah, I think we.
But for me, he was great.
Yeah, me too.
I wouldn't have picked anybody else to be my brewery professor. He was awesome.
I have been golfing in Arizona, and one must drink 4 liters of water for one small piss.
One small piss. That's right. Dude, where'd that come from?
Yeah, right. That was out of nowhere, by the way. There was no context to that. He was saying, oh, you're from America. Here's my American story.
Well, yeah. And he was like, how many people in here have been to the United States? And so he made everybody raise their hand. And of course, you and I were the only ones with our hands up. And then he says that. And it's like, okay, dude, but yes, you're right.
But it's a big country, everybody. But yeah, that's true, I imagine. So now, and we're running long, man. You still got time?
I got time. Yeah.
All right. So we somehow, you did quite well. I think you graduated just behind Holger Lampe, who, if I remember, had the best score in like 30 years at the VLB.
Well, he might have, but he didn't graduate from the same program that we graduated.
Of course. Yeah, that's right.
So I graduated at the top of our course. I'm sure Holger graduated at the top of his, whatever.
Yeah, and I guess I meant to say that more less to point out the differentiation between the courses and more to point out the kind of richness of talent that was there that I got to learn from, certainly.
Well, like those Japanese guys, I mean, there was a guy from Korean, Sapporo, and Asahi.
Yep.
Right. The year before we were there, Augie Four went through that course. Scott Jennings, who runs the Sierra plant in North Carolina, went through that course. So there was a lot of people. Annika from the Far Island, her family owned a brewery. So there was a lot there. It was really, really culturally diverse group of people in that classroom.
Yeah, not forgetting Kamal Tuvachit.
Easy Kamal from Thailand. Kamal was great.
Kamal was great,
but he was a little nutty.
Weren't we all a little bit? He was particularly. And a washout rate that was pretty intense, honestly, in that program. I mean, I think we lost several students by the end of that I may have stuck around like Bruno did, but didn't end up graduating. I know at least one of the Japanese students didn't end up graduating, and I feel like there was a fair amount of that by the end of the program. Yeah, it's different. It was certainly a different experience going through that program than going through an American school, right?
Regardless of topic, right? Because in the American schools, it's like, oh, look, we have to maintain a graduation rate because people pay us to come here. And it was run like a business. So they're sort of motivated to not fail you out. Right. So even if you really don't show up and don't do your work, you get a C. Right. But over there, they were like, listen, if you don't do the work and you don't show up, you don't get a diploma. Right. Thank you for your money. Right. It happened. That happened to a few people. Joel, I think that happened. And I felt terrible because I was like, how do you, I mean, he was a kid, he's 21 years old or something. And I think he was a couple of years older than I was. I mean, I get it, for some people, being, that young and you're living in Germany and it's like beer everywhere. And it's hard to keep yourself on the straight and narrow, right? And so easy to kind of screw yourself up, and he did. And I would always think, man, how is he going to go home and explain that to his family, right? I don't know, right? And they used to intentionally do stuff. I mean, if you remember, like, hey, tomorrow our final exams, but by the way, we're having a party tonight at the pilot plant, and you're expected to be there, and you got to hang out and have a beer or two. So the trick, and it was almost like they did it intentionally. They did to see if you had control of yourself enough to be in this industry. Right. Like you show up where there's free beer, have a beer or two, socialize, and then get home, study for the test, and show up tomorrow prepared and ready to go. Right. Let me add a layer to that. I remember one of those parties, and I remember Dr. Wackerbauer being there, which was an occasion, right? The way that the Germans particularly showed respect and deference to him was something that I'd really never experienced. And there's not that kind of formal culture, at least in the class that I was born into in the United States. But I remember very clearly, because there was a little Wackerbauerism associated with it, sitting at a table. It was in that pilot brewery. And they had a little raised area where there was a table, and Dr. Wackerbauer invited me over to the table to speak German with the unusually, able to speak German American. I think it was just interesting to him. And so I sat down with a beer, and he, well, let's finish our beers and then we can start talking. And we have half beer or whatever, and finished and got another beer and started talking and carried on the conversation. And I was trying to keep up with Wackerbauer, who, by the way, at that time, I was a 6'2", 225, 230 pound ex-football player and wrestler who had drank plenty of beer, right? I was no problem. And Dr. Wackerbauer was what, 70 something? Maybe older. Yeah, he was about 5'2", maybe. 5'2", maybe. Probably went about $120. Yeah, that's probably fair. And I thought, no, okay. I mean, I'll keep up with him. This is a great opportunity to talk to him. So we talked and we had some beer. And I remember thinking, okay, well, that's probably enough beer for me tonight. And at that moment, I remember him pulling out a bottle of vodka and putting it on the table. I got one of those stories too. And say, well, I don't know if he said this to you. When I tried to demur, he said,
"What's wrong, Travis? You're not thirsty?"
Yeah. He didn't say that to me. No.
In English, right? He switched over to English to be like, hey man, get a drink. Yeah, I mean, you're right. There was a lot of that kind of setup happening there, and thank God, by hook or crook, it was able to be gotten through.
Yeah, well, fortunately for me, when he pulled that on me, it wasn't the night before a test. He invited me and a couple of other students in our class to come to this thing that was for the German students. And not Holger and Wilco German students, but the German students in like the 4-year program.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And they were awarding some scholarship from BASF, I think, to one of the kids. Right. Yep. And so they have this dinner and whatever. And, I'm sitting right in the front row because, I'm an ass kisser and whatever.
Yeah, you got to do it.
And dinner's over and he gets up and he's addressing the crowd. And there's maybe 50 or 60 people there. And, he's going on for a few minutes and he looks over and he sees me and he realizes I have no concept of what he's talking about. Right? Just none. So he stops mid speech and he looks right at me and he's like, "Oh, I'm just telling everybody, we had this great dinner. We had Eisbein, which is this boiled pork knuckle, and it's really heavy. And so after dinner, we need to have a digestif." And he pulls out from behind his back like a gallon of Absolute vodka, right? And he walks around a room and he pours a shot for everybody, right? Everyone gets one. And then we do a little cheers and salute and whatever. So we drink it. And then I happen to be sitting at this table with Dr. Hart, who was our chemistry professor and full-on abuser of alcohol on a 100% basis, right? He'd get up on Dr. Hart, his hand with just constant DTs, right? Yep. Good dude, but it's like, oh, dude, you need to check yourself in.
Yeah, end stage.
So in one of Wackerbauer's favorite drinking buddies, right?
Yes.
So he's sitting at my table. Wackerbauer comes over with the remaining half gallon of vodka and sits down at my table. So Dr. Hart, Wackerbauer, and myself, boom, one shot each. They're just going back and forth in German. And I'm just like, well, I'm going to try to hang on for this one. Boom, do the shot. A few minutes later, boom, 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 another. So we do about 4 or 5 shots, right? Now I'm still standing because I just ate like 5 pounds of freaking ice pie, right? But I'm starting to feel it, and it's like, okay, I'm good.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, John, one more, and then that's enough. And I'm like, okay, one more. So we do one more. I'm done. Wackerbauer and Hart sit there and drink the rest of the bottle.
Hell yeah, they did.
Just boom, gone. Yeah. And then, like he always did, Wackerbauer called his like 60-year-old son to come pick his ass up and drive him home, right? And his son shows up and just pissed, right? Just, Dad, why do you always do this to me, right? It was ridiculous.
He's Doctor. Your father is Dr. Wackerbauer. This is an honor for you.
Yeah, you should be honored to pick your drunken ass father up.
Who has no business being that drunk on like a fucking Wednesday.
Right.
But so the VLB is the VLB, and we come back to the United States. We both do. I spent a little bit longer in Germany. You came back for a job that you had already gotten.
No, sort of. I had a couple interviews set up. So about a month or two before we graduated, I started sending out resumes and stuff to sort of prime the pump. And I had one in New York City. I didn't have anything concrete yet, but when I came back, I had a interview in New York City. So I went to that, decided I didn't like that. My brother was living there at the time, so I stayed with him while I was there, and then flew back to my parents. My parents had moved from Indiana to Michigan, while I was doing all the stuff that we've been talking about for the last hour or so. And so I stayed with them outside of Detroit. And at that point, I was like, I've been so far away from my parents for so long, and they're starting to get older. So, I mean, they weren't old at the time. They were probably about, 60 or so, but it's like, I want to get closer to them, right? I don't want to be on the other side of the continent anymore. I want to be able to go see my parents periodically. So I had actually applied for a job at this place in Grand Rapids called The Bob, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
I am familiar.
And this guy that was there, Dennis, I can't remember Dennis's last name off the top of my head, but I knew Dennis from working out in Seattle.
Okay.
He had run a brewery out there called Leavenworth, which was like a town about an hour or so out of Seattle. So we used to cross paths when I was out there. So anyways, I sent a resume there, and he emailed me back, and he's like, look, we don't have anything, but I know these guys that are looking for someone to run their plant, which was New Holland. So he forwarded my resume to them, and they reached out to me, and we set up an interview, and I went and took it. And I was interested in that job because it would have put me in Michigan, and it did put me in Michigan because I ended up getting it. But I remember sitting. They used to have this. The plant in the tap room was in this old auto body shop on Fairbanks Avenue. I mean, it was a piece of shit, right?
Mason jars.
Yeah, and it was barely that building was just falling apart.
Yeah.
But I remember going in there and having the interview with Brett and Jason and this guy, Dave White, who is the general manager and runs all the retail ops. So Dave, the three of us and myself. So we sat there and we were talking about what they were looking for and what I could do and their time and blah, blah. And they were like, well, we're going to, because they were building that new tap room that's downtown Holland. It's still there, I think. They were getting ready to build that. And so we're getting the conversations winding up. And they're like, well, we got to think about it for a couple of weeks. And I look at them and I'm like, I don't know what you're waiting for.
Right.
Like, if we look at this calendar, you want this thing to be open on this day. It's like, you're going to need to do this, 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 and this. When we back it up, it's like, you should have hired somebody a month ago.
Right.
Right. So I'm here now. I'm interested in the job. You going to hire me? Next day, they sent me an email and, we worked out the details and I started, I think, at the end of that week. I mean, it was like, boom.
And this is not to say that, you taking another job after New Holland was any more contentious than any other brewer moving on to a different job. But I'm sensitive to the idea that there may be some stuff that you can't talk about. But one of the questions I wanted to ask, because again, this is now late 2002, more or less.
Yes, it was. I started there in August of 2002.
Okay.
Where that first year, the end of 2002, I want to say we did something like 17 or 1,800 barrels.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah, right. Yeah, 17 or 1,800 barrels. And by the way, this was a distributed and known brewery. Yeah, within Michigan.
They were 5 or 6 years old at that point.
Yeah.
But there was stuff going on, that was just not to professional standard, right? And that's not to run anybody down. I'm not saying that to disparage anybody. It just wasn't, right?
Well, back then
there was no forecasting of sales. There was no production planning. There was no anything, and so it led to a lot of bad decisions, right? Yep. Like, hey, we're going to rack this beer even though it's not ready.
Yeah.
It was interesting because I remember having a conversation early on. We used to make this wheat beer called Zoomer, and the distributor showed up to pick up an order without any notice. I mean, they hadn't even submitted a PO. Right. Had no idea it was coming. All of a sudden, all these people are in my brewery, and they're like, oh, we got to load. And it's like, well, here's what I have that's right that you can have. And we didn't happen to have any Zoomer. We happened to be out of it, but I had some in a tank, and it was like 9 days old. And, one of the principals was like, hey, rack that beer and let's keg it. And I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. It's not ready.
Yeah.
And he was pushing me to do it. And I was like, listen, here's how this is going to go. You can rack it and you can find a new brewer.
Yep.
Or you can get off my fucking dick.
Yep.
Right. That's it.
A mistake has been made here. Let's own it and move forward with quality beer. Right.
Right. And so there was a few months of that where it's like, you had to really dig in and fight because it's a small company, they're fighting for every dollar. And it's like, look, I get it. My whole career has been built out of working in small companies for the most part.
Yeah.
But, the short-term reward of that dollar is going to come back to haunt you 6 months down the road when people aren't buying your beer because they think it sucks.
That's right. 100%.
So, we really had to dig in. It's like, no, this is what we're going to do. And after about 4 or 5 months, we sort of got stuff settled in. We still didn't have forecast. I basically was doing an internal forecast for the production company, looking at what our sales rates were, stuff going out the door,
sure,
and then using that to project, what we needed to make. And, we went from a fulfillment rate that was probably like 50 or 60% on the orders to where we were up over 95%.
Right.
And it's like, that's how you run a production company.
Well, that's certainly how you grow it. Right.
So we grew that. We grew that when I left in 2012. And when I left, we were on pace to do about 25,000. When I left, of course, that didn't, I think it rocked the boat a little bit. And so maybe they ended up at like 22 or 23. Mm-hmm. That was pretty good growth. And I think they're maybe at 40 or 50 or something now. I have no idea.
Last time I talked to Isaac, I have an opportunity to do that occasionally because he calls me about guild stuff occasionally. And he said, yeah, they're up around 50,000 now.
So that's good. Good for them and good for Isaac. I love Isaac. Isaac was great.
Yeah, he's a good dude. He's a solid dude. Same dude though.
Yeah.
So New Holland happens, and I'm watching this, by the way, because by the time you get all this production stuff sorted out, more or less, I'm back in the States, and hopping around in my first few jobs as a brewer.
Yeah, you're over at Michigan Brewing.
I was at Michigan Brewing for a little while, working under Pierre Celis, which was one of the most fantastic things that could possibly have happened to
anybody
someone my age, certainly anybody,
any age, frankly.
Right. And Pierre for sure. But as a brewer, more than just Pierre, it was Jean-Luc Seiss. Pierre was a solid brewer, obviously. But Pierre was more of a kind of a fearless ship captain, more than he was a brewer, right?
Yeah.
And Jean-Luc was this Belgian guy, right? Pierre now, by the way, again, 5 foot nothing, slight, always wore a bolo tie and cowboy boots because he just come from Austin. Jean-Luc, a tall, aquiline nose gentleman, always wore a sport coat and slacks to work. And a very much a traditional European, really a traditional French or Belgian brewer.
Right.
And was responsible, of course, for folks who don't
brewing manager.
A brewing manager. Well, yeah. But I mean,
don't be fooled. You're not wearing khaki pants and loafers out on the brew floor, right?
Right. Well, I mean, by the way, he was also in his 70s at this time.
Yeah.
But and the picture on the label was Jean-Luc and Pierre with their paddles over a wooden mash tun, which never happened for that brand. But he was the kind of guy who would do stuff that would impress somebody my age, right? He would give me these things. So walk over to a fermenter and sniff the blow off hose and tell you, okay, well, this beer is about that old and, it'll have these problems. So now go do an analysis on it or whatever. But Pierre and Jean-Luc, who really did take me under their wing, toward the end of that time, essentially told me, you need to go back to Europe. This is crazy out here in the United States. You don't need this. You should just go back to Germany, go to Belgium. I'll get you a job. You speak French. You can work in France or Belgium. Just don't do this. This is insane, right? The way people run breweries over here. And I couldn't, and I didn't want to. And so we parted ways and of course, lost touch eventually. But anyway, I'm watching, you at New Holland, and other folks, Bell's at that time was still nascent compared to what they are now. Founders certainly was. And all that was happening somewhere on the west side of state in Grand Rapids. But Atwater was kind of happening in Detroit and had this German model. Tom Majorosi was brewing over there at the time, I think. So there were a lot of interesting things happening, but Michigan hadn't by any means established itself within the craft beer community in the United States or anywhere else at that time.
Yeah, but it was on its way.
But it was on its way. Well, thanks to breweries like New Holland increasing some, 1,000% in terms of sales, and a lot of the kind of, Dragon's Milk is kind of an interesting footnote in more than a footnote in Michigan.
Before we get to that, I got to bring up one thing before we move away from your personal history, because I remember, you invited me to come over for dinner one time. Mm-hmm. And, Dan Rogers was a trained chef, right? So Dan, who was your direct supervisor, I think at the time,
he was,
has us to his house for dinner, and he makes like mashed potatoes and steaks, and really, simple but awesome.
Yes.
And we go to the brewery, and he lets me taste this imperial stout he'd made off the tank.
Yep.
Right? And I look at Dan and I'm like, dude, this is good. I was like, are you entering this beer into the GABF? He's like, oh, you think I should? I was like, yeah. And he probably would have done it regardless.
Yeah, maybe.
But I was like, yeah, I think you should. And so then he had a sign-up sheet in the bar. I think I was like the second or third person to go ahead and sign up for a 4-pack because I was so impressed with the beer, right?
Yeah.
And so I get a call however many months later, and I go get my 4-pack and whatever. And Dan enters the beer in the GABF, and I think he won a silver or bronze or something. He won something with that beer anyways. So I bring it all up, right? Because I still have one bottle of that beer sitting in my personal cellar, right? And I'm like, because I'm down to one, right? And I've been carrying it with me for like 15 years.
Yeah, more. Yeah.
And maybe more. Maybe like close to 20.
Almost 20, yeah.
And I keep waiting. It's like, there's got to be some occasion for me to open this.
Yes.
Because I've had it for so long, right? I mean, I don't even know if it's any good anymore. I mean, I'm hoping that it is because it's a huge beer, right? But I've been carrying it with me for so long.
And Dan would just do stuff. This is what was interesting to me about American brewing after really having only the perspective of German brewing. And then I guess some really traditional brewers, at least from Belgium and Pierre and Jean-Luc.
Yeah.
Was that, man, Dan would do stuff like make a bunch of elderflower wine, right? And it was always great. I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing. And more than that, he wanted me and other people around him, although I was really receptive to it. He wanted us to succeed, right? I mean, he wanted us to know how to do what it was that he did. And he was great at explaining it, right? Yep. And my questions would be like, why did you do this, right? Well, I mean, why did you even begin to do this thing, Imperial Stout, for example? That is, difficult. It's going to be inaccessible for some people, and and we're focused right on making beer that people are going to drink, that we can make a lot of and sell a lot of, right? And that's not all that Dan was worried about, and it was really, really important for me to learn that.
Right. Well, and so I think that's a good segue from your European experience with Pierre and Jean-Luc, right? Because those guys are running big breweries, right? And so they want to sell large volumes of beer, right? But American craft breweries, I mean, some of them are that way, right? There's obviously some really large breweries now, as Craft Brewer Sierra in New Belgium, Sam Adams, et cetera. I mean, when those guys put a new product out, it's got a certain amount of pull through it needs to achieve.
Right.
But for the rest of us, right, it's a different game. I mean, we have certain brands that we want to see that happen with, but there's other stuff that, we have the freedom to do. Like I can do something on our pilot system at 3.5 barrels.
Right. And
it can be as weird as I want to make it.
Right.
And there is a subset of our customer base that will just soak that stuff up, right? They love it, right? The weirder it is, the better. And of course, there's part of our customer base that won't like it, but that's okay. Not every beer has to be for everybody, right? And that's the beauty of craft beer, and that's the beauty of what's gone on in America. We've kind of gotten past that hang up, right? Most of the European brewers, and I think to this day, I mean, you're starting to see some craft stuff happen. But even to this day, they're stuck in these traditional styles because these are the styles that sell.
Right.
Yeah, those are the styles that sell for Vorsteiner. That's great.
Right.
You can do other stuff if you want.
Right. Right.
You only need 10 people to like it, and you can sell it all out.
Right. Right. That's right. But it is, it's an American perspective, and I think it can be expressed positively and very negatively here in the States, and that's always been something that the friction between doing it the traditional European way and doing it in the way that American brewers have done it for the last couple of decades has always been, for me, what's interesting about running a brewery and a brand in the United States.
Because you do some of both.
You do some of both. Yeah. You weave them in as applicable, right? And I tend to be a much less experimental brewer than you are. And that has helped me sell a lot of beer. But it's also, something that means that we don't get as much free, press and adoration as some other breweries do. But it has a purpose.
Just because you do it doesn't mean you're going to get the free press either. Right?
Yeah, that's true. Well, that's my perspective.
We get some. We don't. Right. People aren't fawning over us. If you want free press, you better set up shop on one of the coasts.
Oh yeah, I mean, I know how to get free press. I'm about to do it in 2 weeks. I put some strawberry flavoring in my most popular beer, and I sell 9,000 cases. Who cares?
Well,
right?
Exactly. Right. I mean, the votes that I am worried about are the ones people make every day with their dollar bills.
Yeah, 100%.
That's it. Right. I mean,
100%.
Great. And free press and critical acclaim is great. But at the end of the day, if nobody's putting money in your till.
Yeah. Right. Well, and I mean, for us, we ended up hitting it big with New England IPA, which is fine.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
But
you provided me. That was a hard beer for me, right? We were trying to make that style here, and I couldn't figure out how to do it. And you helped me out quite a bit, which was great.
Good.
But it was funny. I think I'm going to go back to Kurt Cobain for a second, right? You ever seen that montage of heck thing that's out there?
Yes.
So at one point, they're going through his diary, and he makes his entry, and he says, "I have to unlearn how to play the guitar."
He did a good job.
Right. And so, making New England IPA, you have to unlearn how to make beer. Right? Because you do a lot of stuff that you're trained to not ever do.
That's true. But for me, having worked with Jean-Luc and Pierre on the Celis Wit and reorganizing that beer for sale or really for production in Michigan. Yeah. That informed everything about New England IPA. I mean, every single thing. And one paper that Sapporo had written about about how to prevent biotransformation, right? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, but that's what we're talking about, this weaving of kind of traditional and non-traditional, and saying, I mean, I think it's important after you reach a certain level in your career, or a certain amount of time doing this, to say, to open yourself up and not be so judgmental, as I've been, and say, okay, well, New England IPA, right? Out of hand, I would like to dismiss this and not worry about it and keep doing what I'm doing, right? Yep. But at the same time, let's put ourselves in a space where this is valid and it is real, and there is a way that we can make this to the same standard, et cetera, as we make other beer. And that kind of exploration is fascinating.
No, I agree. I mean, I had a lot of fun figuring that out. Right? Because it challenged me. Yep. Like you're saying, to give up some of these notions that you have about how you make beer. So that's what I mean when I say you have to unlearn how to do it, right? Yeah. It's like there were certain rules that were immutable. You do not break these rules. This is how you make beer, right? And it always comes out well. It's like, okay, well, if I follow those rules, I can't get to this hazy IPA, pale ale, whatever. So you have to do what you just said and say, okay, let's see what happens. We're going to break these immutable rules, and see where we get to, right? And so really, it challenged all that stuff, and it's like, okay, right? And I had to do that. I had to go through that because I was the same way. I'm not buying this. I think it's horseshit, right? Yep. And it turned out to be a really technical challenge, which was great.
Well, and difficult to, with regard to sales and inventory control, your distributors and your own inventory control, because ultimately people are certainly here because we talked about it a lot. We're, learning or relearning how much better fresh beer is regardless. Now, if you're making a stable New England IPA that's centrifuged and taken care of all the way through the process, is it going to lose more than a West Coast IPA would when it was warm? That's really strongly aromatic? No, not really. But it's an expensive beer to make. It's a horribly inefficient beer if you do it right. And so we charge a lot of money for that beer. And it seemed important then for me to communicate to people, look, you need to get this as, within a couple months, right?
Yeah.
And you want to buy it cold because I don't want to take all that money from you and have you, it's selfish a little bit, and have you pissed at me because it was old and warm.
Yeah.
But I think it started an interesting conversation about freshness, and also, as I was saying, it's almost like selling milk at a certain point, right? Because you can't just fill your brewery up, empty it out, send it to your distributor, and go, okay, you guys got 4 months worth of beer, man, have fun, right?
Yeah.
Or a month or whatever. You have to control their inventory because a distributor will be happy to do anything they fucking want in order to make $1 that day, right? Yeah. So that friction.
Well, and that's what they're used to, right? I mean, that's right. The beers that they traditionally and predominantly handle can deal with that.
Right. So. Well, and this beer can, M43 anymore can just the same way. By the way, it's no Two Hearted, but the same way that Two Hearted, for example, can. I just don't want it to, right? And I want for people to be able to get this fresh, and I think that's a big part of why we've stayed strong with that brand, and it's been such a horse for us year in and year out now. For this is the 6th year that we've been making that beer. So, and it's it's profitable, and there are a lot of great things about it, but it presents its own challenges, and I think. When we by the way, I did want to talk a little bit about Dragon's Milk as still the national example of, I think, at least one of the national examples of a sort of an industrial produced barrel aged stout.
That was an interesting project, right?
Yeah.
So as a by the way, New Holland was making that beer before I got there.
Sure.
Right? But when I got there, I wasn't real enamored with how it was presenting, right? So for better or worse, the principals in that company, basically they said, do whatever you want, right? I mean, they gave me the keys to the brewery. I mean, I could change whatever I wanted, recipe, process. I'm like, oh, okay, great. I will do that then.
Yeah.
So we totally reformatted not only that beer, but the oatmeal stout, which at the time was known as the Poet. I don't know if they still make that or not.
I think they probably do.
But we totally reformatted that process and the barrel aging process and so on and so forth. And that became a huge thing. And at first we were doing it, like we do it here at Warped Wing, or like most breweries do, where it's sort of a one-off drop each year. It was an annual thing, and so on and so forth. And it's an expensive beer to make, but it also has a pretty fair margin on it, better than the regular issue beers, right? Sure. And so we sort of came to terms with that notion. It's like, hey, we're making more money on this beer. If there was a way to increase the production on this beer, we'll make more money.
Yeah.
And so we really pushed it, to get the volume. And it turned into this, all the time core product for New Holland. In doing that, there was a couple of hurdles that we had to cross, right? One of them was, buying new wood all the time is expensive. Right. And there was a point there where, barrels were north of 200 a piece.
Yeah.
They've come down since then, but, it's a lot of money. And at the time that I left, of course, we're burning 300 bourbon barrels every month. Right. So I'm getting a truckload. I mean, and unloading those, they don't load them in on skids, right?
No.
You got to go, manually. We'd have like 4 or 5 guys in the truck, and you're just covered in dirt and sweaty. So it's a lot of barrels, and they're expensive. And so we were starting to play around with, okay, can we use the wood more than once? And over time, we kind of came to this blended ratio, which was 30-40% second use wood into the first use wood. And that was great because it was a significant cost saver for us. But it created some other issues, right? Because second use wood is not as microbiologically stable, right? No. And so we went through a little period there where we were having some shelf stability issues with the dragon's milk. And so we then had to develop a new process in order to make sure, because we didn't have the money to go buy a pasteurizer, right? So I found... I'm going now back to my Tom Clark mentorship. I started doing a search of all the scrap yards, and I found a stainless steel 12R40, which means that 12 candle filters, 40 centimeters long. And so we bought that. We bought all the candle filters. Those sterile candle filters are, by the way, about $1,000 for every 10 centimeters. So at the time, each one was like $4,000, and I got to buy 12 of them in the housing, which I got for next to nothing out of the scrap yard, and we got it cleaned up and put it in. And so we ran this process. By the time we left, I mean, there's a lot of sort of walking into this. It happened over a period of several months and maybe even a year. We started to take the sort of green beer, we would ferment it in the tank. It would sit in the stainless for X amount of time. We did run it through the separator into a second bright tank, and then we would fill all the barrels, first use and second use, right? And label them in the whole deal. And then they would age out for X amount of time. And then the presumption would just be that there would be a microbiological problem with those barrels. Because, one batch would be 100 bourbon barrels. I mean, I can't go through and do a QC battery on each one of the barrels. It's impossible. When I left, I mean, we had 3,000 or 4,000 barrels sitting in this warehouse, right? So the expense and the time associated with it, so the presumption is just like, it's fucked up.
Yep.
And so we would then take all the beer out of the barrels. You would have to taste them, right? I mean, you would see these guys when they were racking them at the end of the shift. I mean, they'd all be glassy-eyed and stuff because they're using a wine thief just to make sure the barrel tastes okay. And it's just like an ounce at a time to make sure it tastes okay. But the presumption was that there would be something growing in it that would make it ultimately not taste okay. So you put it back in a tank, and then we would, because it's already been run through the separator, we would then run it through a DE filter, and then to a plate and frame filter that was nominally sterile, and then to the cartridge filter that was actually sterile. And you had to run through this whole process in order to walk the beer down so that you wouldn't blind up your
sterile
$50,000 in cartridges, right? And then out to another bright tank to be carbonated and packaged and whatever. And that worked out really, I mean, it's a lot of work. We had, there was a woman that worked for us at the time. Her name's Molly Browning. I think she works for Lallemand now. And that was Molly's job, was to keep the barrels, to fill and empty barrels and to keep the barrel cellar organized. And so I would go to Molly and I'd be like, hey, look, we need all the barrels from batch number XYZ. And she would have to go into the barrel cellar and find them, which was not easy.
No.
I mean, I don't know that I could have done it because she had it organized. She knew where everything was. I'd walk in there. I'd be like, what the deuce is going on?
These are all barrels.
Yeah. So she'd pull them all out and, get them emptied. And, we'd always give her someone to assist. There was always like a free pair of hands from the rest of the crew, but it was her job. She knew the process. She directed it. And then whoever we could give her to assist was there to do that, to help assist. And so it's great. She did a great job with that. And, we cranked that stuff out, man.
Yes, you did. And they still do. I mean, we had a brewer who worked here for a while. He was one of our favorite young guys who's come through here ever. His name's Josh Rake, who's since opened a pub in Muskegon where he's from. But he worked at New Holland before he came here. And he also had the opportunity to work with Ron Jeffries. And I'll say it's great to see a kid who was interested in taking that path, right? He wanted to come work at Old Nation because he wanted to learn.
He wanted to learn from you.
Well, Nate and myself. Yep. And he got the opportunity to, and he's just one of these great guys who I told him, in fact, I had him on a podcast. He was one of the first ones we did just to kind of see if I could do it. And I told him the same thing that you told me once, and I don't know if you'll remember this. He'd opened right before the pandemic and was struggling. He was trying to make it work, and he had, a lot of agita around all this. And he had, he was sharing that with me. And what I told him was, again, what you had told me was, listen, man, if anybody can do this, I think you can, right? And I'm here to help you if you need it, right? I mean, if it's a lawyer or if it's equipment or, whatever. I mean, if it's legal to do, I'll do it for you. And if it's not, then maybe we'll figure it out anyway. And I haven't had the opportunity to do that in years, and it felt good to me. I know it bolstered his confidence. I didn't realize really how much I had missed that kind of a relationship until I had the opportunity to have it again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And, that's as they've gotten older, you cherish that stuff more, right?
Yes.
And you realize that really, my job as the brewmaster isn't really to make beer.
No.
Right. My job as brewmaster is to make brewers.
Right. 100%.
And then they make the beer.
100%.
And so it's a real point of pride for me when I look around the various places that I have been and I see guys that I have helped train and brought into the industry, and now they either own their own brewery or they're running their own brewery. I take a lot of pride in that, like John Stewart, who was at Perrin for a long time, Jacob DeRillo at Brewery Vivant. I got a guy here, Jeff Fortney, that's running a brewery called Eudora. It's just, there's tons of them. Right. There's tons of these guys. And I'm sure, if any of them, I'm sorry if I didn't mention your name. But I love them all.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Like children.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of Trust in the Process with John Haggerty and Travis Fritz.
You're responsible for the livelihood of a handful of people. It's scary
to get different perspectives on work, on philosophy toward work, and on the brewing industry specifically. My passion is to make something that is as perfect as I can make it, no matter what it is.
Man, you're super mediocre. Stop being mediocre. You're built to be not mediocre.
So I got back to St. Louis, and we sit in the meeting. I said, okay, guys, what are we going to do with the IPA? And they're like, yeah, we're probably not going to do anything with it.
They weren't drinking beer to get out of their family and to get out of their life and get out of their head.
It was just part of it.
It was part of it. And I think that's what, that was a huge information to me on drinking. And so your first job as a brewer is to not give anyone a hangover they didn't have.